The wind tears across the ridge at 14,000 feet. The air is so thin it feels like breathing through a cloth pressed tight against your mouth. Every inhale burns. Every exhale leaves you hungrier for the next breath. Your legs are already trembling, and you have only climbed for 20 minutes. Your heart pounds against your ribs like it wants to escape. The trail ahead disappears into a knife edge of stone, flanked on both sides by sheer drops into blue shadows so deep they look infinite. Somewhere in the distance, snow-capped peaks rise another 5,000 feet into a sky so cold it seems to glow. And now imagine you are not a tourist with a guide and bottled oxygen. Imagine you are carrying a message that could decide whether an empire lives or dies. Imagine you must run. This is the world of the Inca messenger, the Chasqui, a figure so legendary that Spanish conquistadors who witnessed the system firsthand called it almost supernatural. Chroniclers like Pedro Cieza de Leon wrote with astonishment about messages traveling faster than any horse could carry them. Bernabé Cobo described a network so efficient that fresh fish from the Pacific coast could reach the emperor in Cusco, high in the mountains, before it spoiled. And the question that haunts anyone who reads these accounts is immediate and obvious. How did they do it? How did human beings, without oxygen tanks, without modern medicine, without helicopters or emergency rescue, cross some of the most punishing terrain on Earth and do it faster than seemed physically possible? Most people, when they first hear about Inca messengers, picture a single extraordinary runner. A superhuman athlete who somehow sprinted across entire mountain ranges alone, lungs screaming, muscles burning, defying every limit of human endurance. That image is romantic. It is also almost completely wrong, and the real answer is far more impressive than any lone hero. The truth is that the Inca did not beat the Andes with raw toughness. They beat the Andes with infrastructure, logistics, and one of the most sophisticated communication systems ever built in the ancient world. To understand how this worked, you first have to understand what the Andes actually are. This is not a gentle landscape. The Andes are the longest continental mountain range on the planet, stretching nearly 5,000 miles along the western spine of South America. Peaks rise above 20,000 feet, valleys plunge into shadow. Night temperatures at altitude can drop well below freezing, even in summer. Storms roll in without warning, blanketing passes in snow and turning trails into treacherous slicks of ice and mud. And then there is the air itself. At 12,000 feet, the oxygen pressure is roughly 60% of what it is at sea level. At 15,000 feet, it drops even further. For an unacclimatized person, just walking at this altitude feels like running. Climbing feels like drowning. The body cannot pull enough oxygen from each breath, and the result is a cascade of suffering, headaches, nausea, dizziness, confusion, and in severe cases, collapse. Modern mountaineers call it acute mountain sickness, and it has humbled some of the fittest athletes on Earth. The Inca Empire, at its height, stretched across this terrain for thousands of miles. It governed millions of people across deserts, jungles, and frozen highlands. And it had no horses, no wheels, no written language in the European sense. The empire ran on human feet and human memory. Every command from the emperor, every tax record, every military order, every piece of intelligence about a rebellion or a drought or an enemy movement had to travel physically from one point to another. The stakes were enormous. A delayed message could mean a battle lost before reinforcements arrived. A garbled order could mean famine in a province that never received its grain shipment. The margin for error was zero, and the distances were staggering. So the Inca engineered a solution. They did not ask one person to do the impossible. They built a system that made the impossible routine. The Chasqui network was a relay system. Runners were stationed at intervals along the empire's roads, typically between 1 and 3 miles apart, depending on terrain. Each runner waited at a small shelter, often a simple stone hut with a clear view of the trail in both directions. When a messenger appeared on the horizon, the waiting runner would step out and begin jogging toward him. The approaching Chasqui would shout his message while still running, repeating it in a precise, memorized formula. The fresh runner would match his pace, confirm the message, and then sprint the next leg while the exhausted messenger stopped to rest. The handoff took seconds. There was no pause, no confusion, no lost time. The message simply continued, carried now by fresh legs and full lungs. This is why chroniclers were so astonished. The message itself never stopped moving. Historians estimate that urgent dispatches could travel over 200 miles in a single day, some accounts suggest even faster. A relay of rested runners, each covering only a short burst at near maximum speed, could sustain a pace that no individual human could match over distance. It was the same principle that would later define the Pony Express, the same logic behind modern fiber optic networks where data hops from node to node without ever slowing down. The Inca invented this concept centuries before anyone in Europe had imagined it. But the relay system alone was not enough. Runners needed roads. And not just any roads. The terrain of the Andes would destroy an ordinary path within a single rainy season. Mud would wash away. Stone would crack. Bridges would collapse. So the Inca built the Qhapaq Ñan. The Qhapaq Ñan was a road network spanning an estimated 25,000 miles across the empire. It was not a single highway but a web of routes connecting every corner of Inca territory. And it was built to last. In the highlands, the roads featured retaining walls to prevent erosion. Stone steps carved directly into mountainsides allowed travelers to climb steep slopes without slipping. Drainage channels diverted water away from the path. In swampy lowlands, causeways raised the road above the muck. Along cliffsides, the trail was sometimes cut directly into the rock face, wide enough for a single file of travelers but solid enough to endure centuries. Much of this infrastructure still exists today. Modern hikers walk on Inca stones laid 500 years ago, and they still hold. At regular intervals along the Qhapaq Ñan stood tambos, waystations designed to shelter travelers, store supplies, and keep the system running. A chasqui arriving at a tambo could find food, water, and a place to rest before the next runner took over. Larger tambos served as administrative hubs where officials could coordinate routes and ensure messages were not lost. Nearby, qollqas storehouses held provisions for messengers, soldiers, and laborers. These were not random stockpiles. They were carefully managed reserves, stocked with dried goods that could survive months in the cold mountain air. The Inca understood that reliability depended on predictability. If a runner knew exactly where he could find shelter and food, he could push harder and travel faster. And then there were the bridges. The Andes are slashed by deep gorges and raging rivers. In many places, there is simply no way around. You must cross. The Inca solved this with suspension bridges made of woven grass and fiber, anchored to stone foundations on either side. These bridges swayed in the wind. They creaked under weight. They hung over drops that would mean certain death if you fell. Chroniclers described crossing them as terrifying even for seasoned travelers. But they worked. Communities were assigned the sacred duty of maintaining specific bridges, replacing worn fibers, reinforcing anchor points, and ensuring the crossing remained safe. One such bridge, the Qhapaq, is still rebuilt every year using traditional methods, a living link to Inca engineering. The infrastructure was extraordinary, but it still does not explain how flesh and blood humans survived and performed at these altitudes. The answer lies in biology, selection, and generations of adaptation. People who grow up at high altitude develop physiological differences from lowlanders. Their lungs are often larger. Their blood carries more hemoglobin, the molecule that binds oxygen. Their capillaries are denser, allowing more efficient oxygen delivery to muscles. These are not supernatural gifts. They are the result of living, generation after generation, in thin air. The Inca did not recruit chasqui from the coast and drag them into the mountains. Messengers were drawn from highland communities, people whose bodies had spent a lifetime adapting to the environment. When a chasqui ran at 14,000 feet, his physiology was working with the altitude, not against it. But even acclimatized runners have limits. This is where the relay logic becomes essential. Each chasqui ran only a short distance, perhaps a mile, perhaps 2 or 3 before handing off to the next. That distance could be covered at a sprint or a fast jog without pushing the body into oxygen debt. The runner never had to sustain effort long enough for altitude to break him down. By the time fatigue set in, the message was already in someone else's hands. The system did not demand superhuman endurance. It demanded discipline, organization, and trust. Fuel was another problem. Running burns calories. At altitude, in cold weather, the body burns even more just to stay warm. Modern endurance athletes rely on engineered gels, electrolyte drinks, and precisely calculated nutrition. The Inca had none of that, but they had something else. Centuries of knowledge about preserving food in the Andean environment. Chuño is freeze-dried potato, created by exposing potatoes to the freezing night air and then crushing out the moisture. It is light, calorie-dense, and can last for years without spoiling. Charqui, the origin of the English word jerky, is dried meat, salted and cured in the dry mountain wind. Maize could be ground into flour and mixed with water. These foods were not gourmet, but they were portable, durable, and packed with the energy a runner needed. Storehouses along the route meant Chasqui did not have to carry everything with them. They could resupply at each tambo, eating enough to recover and then running light. There is also the matter of coca. Chroniclers frequently mention that Chasqui chewed coca leaves during their runs. Coca is not cocaine, the concentrated alkaloid extract is a modern invention. The raw leaf, when chewed with a catalyst like lime, releases a mild stimulant that can suppress hunger, reduce fatigue, and ease the discomfort of altitude. Indigenous Andean populations had used coca for millennia before the Inca, and it remained a sacred and practical part of highland life. For a messenger facing cold, exhaustion, and thin air, coca was one more tool in a carefully assembled kit. The message itself was a marvel of precision. Chasqui carried spoken orders, memorized word for word, and repeated exactly at each handoff. For complex administrative data, tax records, census counts, inventories, the Inca used quipu, knotted cords that encoded information through the position, color, and type of knots. A quipu could not be read like a book. It required a trained specialist, a Qhapaq, to interpret. But for a chasqui, the quipu was simply a physical object to carry a data packet, protected from distortion because it could not be accidentally altered by a tired voice. Picture the scene. A runner appears on a ridge, silhouetted against the sky. His chest heaves, his legs churn. A watcher at the post spots him and steps onto the trail, already jogging forward. The approaching chasqui shouts the message, a string of syllables, precise and urgent. The fresh runner repeats it back. Confirmation. Then he is gone, sandals slapping stone, body leaning into the descent. Behind him, the first runner stops, hands on knees, gasping in the thin air. In a few hours he will run again, carrying another message in the opposite direction. The chain never breaks. Night falls. The temperature drops. Stars blaze in a sky so clear it seems you could touch them. Somewhere on the mountain, a chasqui runs by torchlight, following a path he knows by feel as much as sight. The wind howls through the pass. His breath fogs in the cold. But the message must move. An empire depends on it. The real marvel here is not that one extraordinary person outran the Andes. Plenty of people could run a mile or two at altitude, given the right body and the right training. The marvel is that an entire civilization built a system so robust, so redundant, so perfectly engineered that human beings became the infrastructure. The Chasqui network was not a collection of individual heroes. It was a living machine, a biological communication grid stretched across thousands of miles of impossible terrain. Each runner was a node. Each tambo was a server. Each quipu was a data packet. The Inca did not defy nature with brute force. They negotiated with it, mapping its limits and designing a system that worked within them. When the Spanish arrived, they inherited pieces of this network. They used the roads, they marveled at the bridges, but they never fully replicated the system that had made it run. The knowledge of how to train messengers, how to manage relays, how to coordinate thousands of handoffs across an empire, that expertise belonged to a world the conquest would unravel. Today, the Qhapaq Ñan is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Sections of the original road still carry travelers. The Quezhuachaca Bridge still sways above the canyon, rebuilt each year by hands that remember. And somewhere in the archives of history, the memory of the Chasqui endures not as a superhuman, but as proof of what ordinary humans can achieve when a civilization decides to engineer the impossible. The next time you send a message instantly across the world, remember this. 5 centuries ago, in the thin air of the Andes, an empire solved the same problem with stone, rope, and human lungs. And they made it look effortless.